Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this, the 7th meeting in 2014 of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee. Can I welcome members and our witnesses and visitors in the public gallery. And I can remind everyone, please, to turn off or at least turn to silent their mobile phones and other electronic devices so they don't interfere with the sound equipment. We have apologies this morning from Dennis Robertson, and we're joined by Joan McAlpin as a substitute. Item 1 on the agenda is a continuation of our inquiry into Scotland's economic future post-2014. And we are joined by a distinguished panel. I'll just introduce you all left to right. We have Sir John Gieve, who's Visiting Professor at University College London, Professor Ronald MacDonald, Adam Smith Professor of Political Economy, University of Glasgow, Dr. Monique Ebell, who's Research Fellow at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, Professor Anton Muscatelli, who is the Principal of Glasgow University, but here in a personal capacity, and Professor Jeremy Peat, Director of the David Hume Institute. Good morning to you all and welcome. Now, we are hoping to run the session probably for about 90 minutes or so, aiming to finish about 11:30. Because we've got a large panel, I'm not going to ask you to make any opening statements, but we'll just go straight into questioning. And although we do have a bit of time in hand, I would just remind members, if they would, to keep their questions short and to the point, and if we could have answers as concise and to the point, that would be very helpful. And I would ask members, if they would, rather than address a question to all 5 members of the panel, perhaps if they could initially address it to a particular member of the panel, and then if you would like to come in and respond to a question that's been directed to somebody else, if you just catch my eye, I will bring you in as time allows. And particularly, I think, if you strongly agree or disagree with a point a fellow panel member has made, it'd be good to catch my eye and try and come in to make your point. Right, I wonder if I could maybe just start off and ask you, maybe just take a couple of minutes each and address this I suppose, key point. What, in your view, is the optimal currency arrangement for an independent Scotland? And also, what would be the optimal currency arrangement for the rest of the United Kingdom in the event that Scotland voted for independence? Maybe we could just start with Sir John Gieve and just work our way along the panel, and maybe 2 or 3 minutes from each of you. Sir John.
On the first question of what would be best for an independent Scotland, I think it's understandable that the Scottish Government thinks a formal currency union in which the Bank of England remains the central bank and probably prudential regulator for Scotland as well as England under some joint arrangement of governance looks attractive. It's not, it would certainly be optimal to begin with because the economies are very integrated. Over time, it's likely to get less optimal, and the different weight of oil and gas in particular, as no doubt others will say, could make it uncomfortable even then to have a currency union whose policy will be adapted as it is today largely for the rest of the UK. From a ruck point of view, I think I can't see any real reason why the rest of it would be in the rest of the UK's interests to agree to a formal currency union on anything other than exceptionally controlling terms. If Westminster retained effective control of fiscal policy in Scotland, as well as monetary policy, that would be acceptable. But politically in the north, that's unlikely to be acceptable. So I think from the rest of the UK's point of view, they'd probably prefer an informal currency union That is one in which they don't have any legal obligations to Scotland at all and rely on the markets to constrain Scottish policy. 2, a formal currency union, and I don't think a separate currency would worry them hugely.
Clear, by an informal currency union, Sir John, what you mean is Scotland using the pound sterling.
Yes. It's a
in
sort
the
of
same way
Irish
Panama uses
solution.
the dollar.
I mean, Ireland did this for 50 years after independence. Of course, very, very different situation and economy. But in effect, it had a currency board which was backed 1-for-1 with British notes. And that, under that arrangement, the institutions in London have no legal obligations to support or monitor or negotiate policy with Scotland.
Okay. Thank you. Professor MacDonald.
Yes, I would take as my starting point the fact that we've had a long-standing monetary union within the United Kingdom for over 300 years. And what we've seen and what most commentators have noted is a considerable amount of convergence in that time. So if you look at productivity differentials, if you look at GDP per capita, they're all very similar at the moment. But the question with respect to designing a suitable policy for an independent Scotland is to look at what the economy is going to look like post-independence. Now, there's a number of reasons to believe that as you move away from unity with the rest of the UK, you're going to start to diverge. Now, that process for a lot of variables like productivity may take some time. But one thing is for sure, on day one of independence, Scotland will have diverged quite significantly, because if it gets its share of North Sea oil, then it will be a net exporter of hydrocarbons. It will become a commodity producer and a net exporter of hydrocarbons to boot. Now, what that means, and it's highly significant in a Scottish context, because Scotland has, at the moment, a very rich and wide traded sector, which is non-oil. And the problem with having a commodity as part of your traded bundle is that the shocks that hit commodity prices are different to the shocks that hit the rest of your trade. So if you are going to be part of a monetary union, for example, post-independence, you are not going to be able to deal with these oil shocks, and that is going to have very significant knock-on effects for your non-oil sector. It's going to affect the competitiveness of that sector, which is the crux of any hydrocarbon-producing countries. If you look at Gulf countries, any country that is a net exporter of hydrocarbons, they face this problem. It's usually referred to as the resource curse, and you can see it most clearly in Norway. So post-independence, the only option that I can see for an independent Scotland is a separate currency. Nothing else will work. Nothing else will be credible to markets. For the rest of the UK, I think that is the only option as well, because if Scotland were to be part of the rest of the UK, much is made of the transactions costs for the rest of the UK in terms of Scotland remaining as part of a monetary union. But these transactions costs are well known to be very small relative to the potential costs of the monetary union breaking up. And I think there are big issues there with the credibility of statements that have been made with respect to any potential monetary union, but that's perhaps something we can return to later.
Ebell.
Yes, I would agree that the most appropriate currency choice for an independent Scotland would be to have its own currency, mainly because this would give Scotland the greatest capacity to react to shocks. And this is particularly important given the level of debt which Scotland is likely to begin its life as an independent country with. For the simple reason that if you shut down monetary policy, the ability to react to shocks becomes restricted to fiscal policy, to either increasing debt or running some sort of an austerity policy. But given the level of debt that Scotland is likely to begin life with, increasing debt further might be rather difficult, and it might be quite expensive. So this would really, being in a monetary union, would narrow Scotland's range of policy choices quite dramatically, and I can't imagine that this would be in the best interests of an independent Scotland. Now, as far as the rest of the UK is concerned, I would also agree with Sir Gieve and Professor MacDonald that it is difficult to see how a formal monetary union that would involve sharing the Bank of England would be in the interests of the rest of the UK, simply because this would involve the rest of the UK taking on the role of insurer to a sovereign country. Now, the rest of the UK did, or the UK as a whole did at some point decide to remain outside the European Monetary Union, despite the fact that actually the UK has trades quite substantially with the rest of with the European Union, and hence the UK has already decided that the transactions costs to staying outside of the European Monetary Union are small enough relative to the risks involved in joining that union. So from that perspective, I think it's very credible to not wish to join a sterling zone. And from the perspective of the rest of the UK, what would be optimal? I would say that that would have to be Scotland having its own currency, simply because this would put Scotland on the most stable footing, both in terms of fiscal policy and in terms of its financial sector.
Thank you. Professor Muscatelli.
Well, as you've seen from my written evidence, I take a different view. I strongly support the view of the Fiscal Commission Working Group that a monetary union, a sterling currency union between the rest of the UK and Scotland would be optimal for both sides immediately following independence. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. It's partially about transactions costs, which of course are difficult to estimate, as I say in my paper, but it could be substantial. But it also goes beyond other costs which cannot be easily estimated and which would impact, I think, considerably on both sides, given that there is such convergence. Now, over the medium term, a different arrangement might be optimal, but that will take a considerable amount of time. And as I say, I think some of the views around the optimality or not of a monetary union have been influenced by what we've seen happening in the European Monetary Union in the last few years. But as I explain in my paper, I think the situation between Scotland and the rest of the UK is very, very different from that of the European Monetary Union. I also, as I explain in my paper, there's a number of other considerations, and I would just highlight a couple to start with. One is that no monetary arrangement will actually completely insulate you against shock. So having your own currency, or indeed having an informal monetary union in itself, doesn't solve the problem. There are going to be shocks which are transmitted even within monetary unions, or even if you have different currency arrangements. The other point which I make is that if, for whatever reason, a sterling currency zone isn't negotiated, and ultimately it's a political judgment and a political negotiation, not just an economic consideration, then there are still risks to both the rest of the UK and Scotland. For instance, an informal monetary union, as I point out, is very different from what happened in Ireland when Ireland achieved independence, or what Panama or Montenegro are doing at the moment with respect to the dollar or the euro. It's different because Scotland is 10% of the overall UK economy. So would the rest of the UK really want a country informally using its currency on its doorstep with, say, roughly 10% of the UK money supply being used somewhere else? It might not be optimal, I argue in the paper, to do that. So ultimately, as I say, I would think that there are ways of handling the issue of the hydrocarbon problem. An oil fund would be the way to do that, probably, in smoothing out public expenditure and revenues over time. But if that option, which is the best option, I think, for Scotland and the rest of the UK, which is a sterling currency area, isn't negotiated for whatever reason, then I think the best, the second best option would probably be a Scottish currency as opposed to any informal arrangement.
Good morning. I start from looking at what I believe would be best for Scotland in terms of providing sound and stable conditions for economic performance. I think this is what matters, and I believe there's a great deal of scope for improvement and progress after what we've been through over the last 6 years or so. and therefore I'm looking for as much stability as can be achieved. So in principle, one starts with a preference for there being currency stability with the rest of the UK, which is far and away our main trading partner, and where the extent of corporate relations and other relationships that have emerged over the last many centuries are massive. So anything other than currency stability would, for me, not only involve significant transaction costs, as Anton Muscatelli has pointed out, and other related costs, but also be likely to involve significant disruption in trading relations and business relations, which I think could be quite damaging to Scotland. So stability is, to me, extremely important. The problem is, as John Gieve has said, that this might only be achievable over what I think he called exceptionally controlling terms, so far as the rest of the UK is concerned. And that, to me, would mean that Scotland has no control whatever over monetary policy, as Ronald MacDonald has said, and in fact the control over fiscal policy might be severely curtailed. So the two major instruments of macroeconomic policy would be really limited so far as Scotland is concerned within the currency union. So one has to play off the advantage of the currency stability and what is best for the continuation and development of relationships and the development of our economy, with this concern that actually the freedom, the independence of economic policy would be severely curtailed. That leads me to think that one needs to look seriously at a second option, and I agree with all the other people giving evidence today that the only other option which merits consideration is an independent currency. I think that would be the way forward, because that would permit full control over monetary and fiscal policy, and it would enable a way forward. However, I think there would be a risk of significant volatility in our currency, in our relationships, being a petro currency and being a newly emerging currency, and that in turn might lead to a need for very tight monetary and fiscal policies. And all the evidence I've seen from David Skilling and others shows that successful small economies run very tight ships so far as monetary and fiscal policy is concerned, and a newly emerging, relatively small economy with such an emphasis on oil and gas would, I think, be required to run even tighter policies than many small successful economies do now. So I'm afraid I'm not going to give you an unequivocal choice. My preference in principle, without doubt, is the currency union, provided that that can be achieved on terms that allow sufficient independence of policy and action that enables Scotland to look after its own interests in the emerging environment it finds. If that is not possible, if, as someone has described it, the only settlement on the table is one that no self-respecting nationalist would accept, then I think one has to look at the alternative. And the only alternative to me that makes sense to examine is that of the independent currency, which is certainly achievable and certainly doable, but is not the soft, easy option. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful from all of you, just in terms of setting the scene, and clearly, you know, a division of opinion, but that's welcome. Okay, I think we'll open it up to questions. I'm sure we'll tease out some more of these issues. Start with Mike McKenzie.
Thank you, Convener. My questions are pretty much for Professor Muscatelli. You mentioned just briefly that you felt that the comparison between the sterling area and the EMU, the European Monetary Union, is not a valid one. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes, I mean, essentially I think I would want to make 3 points. The first is that if you compare the level of integration which exists at the moment between Scotland and the rest of the UK, and any pair of countries you might wish to choose in the current Eurozone, it's very, very different. There are no border effects at the moment between the rest of the UK and Scotland. The European Monetary Union wasn't integrated. In a sense, the European Monetary Union is started off as a set of very different countries with a high volume of trade flow, but still with substantial border effects. A common currency was introduced, and of course, the issue then is that was a mismatch with the level of integration which was there. Scotland and the rest of the UK start in a very different position. We start from a high degree of integration. value chains are between businesses are highly integrated. The volume of trade flows is absolutely huge from both sides. Trying to remember figures off the top of my head, but you're talking about, for the rest of the UK, it's certainly the second largest sort of Scotland is the second largest trade partner. But I mean, in terms of volume, it's absolutely huge. The other point was that, of course, the European Monetary Union, its fiscal rules and its governance was deeply flawed. I mean, a number of us were commenting at the time, immediately after the creation of the Monetary Union, pointed out that some of its fiscal rules were asymmetric, they weren't sufficiently tight. Of course, the accession rules in themselves were softened in such a way that the Eurozone really started not on a great footing. It's a totally different situation here between the rest of the UK and Scotland, who have start from a very coordinated fiscal economic cycles, very similar levels of productivity. And as other speakers have said, that's the starting point, and it's very, very different. And it's not likely to change dramatically over time, particularly if a currency union is maintained. Now, if a currency union isn't maintained, actually that will impact on that degree of integration. But if it is maintained, it's likely to persist. The other point, which I think is sometimes been ignored, is that also the way in which fiscal policy would work immediately after independence, if there is a sterling monetary union, is that there's going to have to be fiscal rules for both sides, for both Scotland and the rest of the UK. But we also start with a very interesting position, which doesn't exist in EMU, is that we start essentially with a mutualised debt position. I think the most likely arrangement, and in a sense has been confirmed by statements from the UK government recently, is that the rest of the UK would actually be responsible for servicing the debt. But Scotland would, of course, contribute towards those interest payments and only issue its debt over time. Now, there's a very long average maturity of UK debt at the moment. So, in a sense, it's not quite an exact parallel. It's a sort of loose parallel, but anyway, there's been much talk in EMU at the moment about the possibility of Eurobonds and common finance. So actually, it's a very different, in a sense, this is a parallel. You start with a mutualised debt position, which will unwind very, very slowly over time. So these are three reasons, I think, which highlight how very different European Monetary Union is from a potential sterling currency zone.
Thank you. That's a very comprehensive answer that's anticipated some future questions, so that will maybe save some time. In terms of a sustainability agreement, do you feel that that would still allow scope for fiscal flexibility? And what do you think the limits of that would be in, for either country, both Scotland after independence and our UK?
You would need to have two broad fiscal rules. One certainly governing the deficit, and of course the rule that, as I say, was put in place in the Eurozone wasn't satisfactory because it was a deficit ceiling. Ideally, you probably want a deficit rule which maintains budget balance, structural budget balance over the economic cycle, and that would apply to both partners. The other is a debt sustainability rule, which I wouldn't necessarily formulate again the way in which the Eurozone did it, by setting a 60% debt ceiling. I think, frankly, very few countries around the OECD at the moment would be able to satisfy that. It's really more about debt sustainability. It's ensuring that the debt to GDP ratio can be managed over time. So those are the two key rules. Now, within that, the two countries could run very different fiscal policies. Scotland might wish, and I'm just as a hypothesis, they might want to run a more progressive income tax policy. It may want to run a very different welfare and labour market policy. The key thing is that there has to be a rule on deficits or budget balance, and there has to be a rule on debt sustainability. Those are the envelopes that have to be set. Within that, they could run very different policies on taxation and spending.
Final question then really is that you're probably aware that the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, their calculation suggests that after independence, Scotland would have a debt to GDP ratio of about 81%, whereas the RUK's would be 104%. Do you feel that would have any implications for a sustainability agreement and how each country could live within that agreement?
clearly, the starting position will depend on the negotiation on the debt, and the figures you cite, as you say, came out of one configuration of the National Institute paper on this. Yes, I mean, as I say, I think it's less important to focus on the debt to GDP ratios that you start with and more around debt sustainability. The key thing for both parties and indeed for the monetary authority, the Bank of England that would be running the sterling currency union, is to ensure that the debt path is sustainable. And that is partly dependent on the starting position, but to a large extent it's also looking at issues like growth rates over time. It's looking at things like the real interest rate. So it's also to do with prospective medium-term fiscal policy. So yes, the starting point would need to be taken into account, but it's about more than that. And I would focus less on the initial debt to GDP ratio than the package, which is also around debt sustainability.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I know Chick Brody's got a follow-up. I just want to say to the other members of the panel, this is not question time with Professor Muscatelli, refreshing as it is to hear his views. So other members of the panel who wish to come in and express an opinion, please just catch my eye and do that. Yes, Professor Peat. Yeah.
I just wanted to add one small point to what Professor Muscatelli said, which is a complication for the rules both on deficits and debt sustainability would be what assumptions to feed in with regarding to oil and gas revenues, given they would be a very high percentage of expected revenues and to a degree uncertain. One would have to determine what projection to use and what percentage of that projected revenue to take into account in agreeing any forward-looking anticipated deficits and debt levels. And we all know that nobody knows what the level of oil and gas revenues are going to be in the future, and there can be very wide variation in those estimates. So there would need to be a way of dealing with that, both in getting to some view of the range, at least, of those revenues, and secondly, in knowing to what extent one took account of those revenues within the deficit and debt rules. That is a complication that I think would need to be addressed. Thank you.
It goes to Sir John Gieve first and then Dr.
I agree strongly with that, because the cycle that matters is the future cycle rather than the past. We saw in the UK the dangers of sort of redefining the cycle in the past to try and make the books balance. It's the next one that counts, and so what's going to happen to oil and gas will be key in that. The other point I was going to make, I agree with Professor Muscatelli that the fiscal rules in the euro area are deficient, and they should be more symmetric. But that is quite a big ask of the rest of the UK. So, I mean, what you're saying is that their fiscal policy and stance should be governed by some supranational arrangements vetted by an independent body appointed by both governments. I think that sort of illustrates why a formal currency union may be quite difficult to negotiate.
Dr. Ebell?
I'd like to take up Professor Muscatelli's point that Scotland and the UK are currently very well integrated in terms of their goods markets, but also in terms of their capital markets. And I think it's important to remember that the high degree of integration of the capital markets may actually work against the stability of a currency union. The reason being that if the currency union, if Scotland's continued membership in the currency union were to suffer a weakness in credibility at any point, we could expect, due to the highly integrated capital markets, we could expect capital flight to be a real issue. Now, we have a historical example of this. The Czech and Slovak economies were also highly integrated, with highly integrated capital markets. The Czech and Slovak, upon the Velvet Divorce, the Czech and Slovak governments agreed a formal monetary union that did involve sharing the central bank. But within weeks of that monetary union, there were expectations that this monetary union would not be long-lasting, would not endure, and we did see a substantial amount of capital flight, and as a result, the monetary union had to be dissolved. So I'd like to make the point that although trade integration is surely a very important component, or an important component in making a monetary union sound and sustainable, capital market integration might actually work the other way.
Professor MacDonald, and I'll go back to Anton Muscatelli.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on a point that Dr. Ebell made, which I think is very crucial to the sustainability of a potential monetary union post-independence, and that is that for such a regime to fly with financial markets, with capital markets, it's got to be credible. Now, the signal that we have from the Scottish Government is that this is a short-term arrangement. Indeed, I notice in Professor Muscatelli's evidence, he implicitly assumes that it's a short-term arrangement as well. We know that, and the Czech-Slovak example is quite a good one, we know that you have to make an irrevocable commitment to a peg for that peg to work, and that has not been given. Indeed, a statement to the contrary has been given by the Scottish Government that it's open to them on day one of independence to choose another exchange rate regime. Now, what that means, and this leads me to my second point, what that means in terms of the resource curse I mentioned, which I noticed that in the Fiscal Commission's document and also in our discussions today, the focus is always on the effects that oil has on the budget deficit of an independent Scotland. The focus is never on the effects it's going to have on the non-oil sector, which to me is a crucial thing, and it will make any monetary union be unsustainable. And if it's unsustainable in 2 or 3 years, it's unsustainable today, because that's how capital markets work, particularly if there is no irrevocable commitment to that peg, which indeed is the case today.
I would make 2 points. In the case of the Czech and Slovak Republic, I think one of the problems with monetary union was, in fact, that there was no attempt to coordinate fiscal policy, which is clearly has to be part of the cornerstone of any agreement. And this is back to the point that it has to be a comprehensive agreement. I think I'm much more optimistic on the issue of whether the arrangements have to be permanent. I would make 2 points. First of all, yes, markets do tend to react to one-way bets. We saw that with the European exchange rate mechanism. But they don't react to uncertain regimes which might change in 15, 20 years' time. And my personal view is that if a sterling currency union were chosen, actually that degree of trade integration would actually persist for quite a long time. You wouldn't see border effects emerge very quickly. It's actually quite instructive. Governments always think that monetary and fiscal and macroeconomic regimes they put in place last forever. But actually, if you look at the UK since 1979, we've had about 6 different macroeconomic policy regimes. Yet when they were instituted, none of them were one-way bets. Mrs. Thatcher introduced effectively a monetarist type model in 1979. It was abandoned in the mid-80s because monetary targets didn't work that well, so they worked with more eclectic targets. We then moved to shattering the Deutschmark. We then moved to the ERM. We then exited the ERM, went to inflation targets, but with monetary policy controlled by UK government. And then we went to an independent Bank of England. At no stage at the beginning of these regimes did the markets say, my goodness, there's a problem in 5 or 10 years' time, and therefore we're going to take a one-way bet. The point is there going to be a one-way bet? And I think the likely shocks that could hit a sterling currency union, yes, there could be a major oil discovery in Scotland, 5, 10 years out, but it could also be a shock going the other way. Unless there's a one-way bet, it's unlikely that these issues would arise immediately. There would be issues that would need to be managed over time. And that's why I come back to the issue of how would you set up an oil fund? How would you set up the fiscal rules? These are critical to the design of a currency union, and these would need to be obviously addressed as part of that.
Yeah, I know other Parliament wants to come back in. I think we need to get some more questions, though, and try and move things on. We could just all sit back and let you debate amongst yourselves, which might be quite interesting for the next hour and a half. But I think we have to justify our position. So I'll bring in Kimberly for supplementary, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Thank you. Good morning. We just had the comment by Professor Muscatelli about the possibility of oil going up, and of course it's just not North Sea oil that we're talking about. There are opportunities elsewhere around Scotland's waters. In a refreshing document, I have to say, Professor Muscatelli talked about the perspective of what his view might be the choices for the rest of the UK in the event of independence. I wonder if I may ask, first of all, Sir John Gieve, and then Professor Muscatelli. The governor of the Bank of England in October in a speech said that in the next 30 years, it's possible that the assets of the banks will be 9 times the GDP of the UK economy. Now, when we talk about volatility, does that not scare you in terms of what might happen to the UK economy, and if Scotland votes no, being part of it, if we have one sector which not only has that amount of asset capability, but also has sucked resources, which I'm going to come to Professor Peat in a minute, about actually sucks resources from the rest of the UK's capability to produce and export. And the second question, and just related to that, Scotland's performance relative to the UK, and I've just got the GERS figures this morning, that show that even with a drop in oil revenues caused in part by record tax-deductible £14 billion of investment spending by oil companies, Scotland's current budget balance at 5.9% of GDP is almost identical to that of the United Kingdom. Our trade situation is much better. We have a surplus as opposed to a huge deficit in the UK. Looking at it through the frame of reference of the UK, what would happen in the event of these, the circumstance of the assets being so great and concentrated in one sector, and also a not very good performance, financial performance, either in trade deficit or indeed fiscal deficit from the rest of the UK?
That's quite a suitcase of a question, really. I think what Mark Carney was saying wasn't that we were going to see the financial sector grow to great lengths. He was making the point that in itself that didn't scare him, providing regulation was strong enough, it could be made safe. My personal view is that I would be worried if it got to that scale. We came very close in the financial crisis of 2008-9 to having banks which were too big to save, let alone too big to fail. I mean, famously, in Ireland and Iceland, the banks were too big to save. We and the Swiss were quite close to that position. As it turned out, we were able to save them. But if they'd been twice as large again, I think that would have been a potential problem. So I'm perhaps a bit less relaxed than the governor is on that. I mean, on your point about would that mean that the whole economy was unbalanced and was running a chronic trade deficit and so on and so forth? Certainly it would be very concentrated if the finance sector ever grew to that level, but it would have to grow to that level on the back of being an international financial centre and selling its wares abroad. So I don't think it follows at all that that the current account deficit would get ever bigger. It would be a source of invisible export earnings. Sorry, does that answer at least half the questions?
That's half the question. The other question is the concentration of resource, which I'd like to come back to Professor Peat on in terms of productivity and innovation, which is being denied the rest of the country. Yes, have you in mind?
I start from the position of what Scotland wants out of the banking sector in order to aid its performance and aid the development of well-being broadly defined within Scotland. And I think there are two aspects that seem to me of importance. One is actually having the facility to lend and service the requirements of households and businesses in Scotland. Most of those businesses are relatively small. Some one hopes are growing and innovating, although not as many as one would wish. As I've said in my small note to you, I still think there's a huge problem with the lack of utilisation of higher education research activity in terms of development of that into burgeoning, competitive, productive exporting businesses. And I think that one answer as to why there isn't enough there may be the issue of finance. So I look to the financial sector, the banking sector, providing a vigorous competitive source of funding and support for households and businesses in Scotland. That would involve access to some investment banking facilities for the very largest corporates, but it's mainly good old retail, corporate and commercial banking that I'm looking for. And I would like to see a wide proliferation of banks. I'd like to see more of those entering the market so that one gets away from a broad duopoly of banking within Scotland at the SME level towards a more competitive and therefore beneficial market. And I know some things have been said about that by Holyrood committees. So I welcome that, and I remember giving evidence to this committee about 3 years ago when I talked about may many flowers grow. And at the same time, I actually said that I thought at that time that the centre of gravity of the Royal Bank of Scotland had moved south. And I think that was true, and I think that is increasingly true now, which turns to the other advantage that Scotland can have from the banking sector is having head office type functions which actually help to develop our professional service sector, our business service sector, in a way that then is a benefit to other growing companies, so that we have the right lawyers, the right actuaries, the right accountants of high skill that can be here in Scotland, rather than coming up and down on the plane from London, as was the case many years ago and may increasingly be the case now. So I look for those two benefits. So I like to see more head offices of small retail, commercial, corporate banks in Scotland. I think that can have the dual effect of providing the banking services that can help, and also help to stimulate the financial and business service sector, and indeed provide a labour market that allows people to see there is a career here where they can grow and develop. So those are the advantages I see. I'm not sure what the advantages to Scotland are of having a nominal head office here, which is has associated with it the risks that are largely related to the investment banking activities, which are not those that we are particularly interested in. So if the head office of RBS and or HBOS were to formally move out of Scotland, I am not sure, and I need to look at this more carefully, I'm not sure what the loss would be to Scotland in terms of the interests of our economy. I would be worried if we didn't have the competitive financial sector. I would be worried if we didn't have a sufficient head office base to stimulate those financial and business services. But I'm not particularly worried if investment banking, casino banking sticks in London and the risks associated stick in London. I left RBS in 2005. I'd like to emphasize before the 2000. But I obviously have watched what's going on over that time, and I do stick to the view that there are two real benefits the banking sector can bring to Scotland, and we need to think about what it is we want and try to see how we can encourage that to the benefit of our economy.
Mr. Muscatelli, in terms of the perspective, RUK's perspective.
Can I ask one follow-up question?
Yeah, of course.
Just as you mentioned, RBS, Professor Peat, you're the former chief economist at RBS.
Long time former.
Well, I mean, do you have a view on the comments from Mark Carney yesterday that in the event of independence there was a distinct possibility RBS to have to move its head office south of the border?
I haven't read his remarks in detail. I haven't spoken to anyone, but it would not surprise me in the slightest if there were contingency plans in place for RBS and other financial institutions and other significant corporates to move head offices. If they look at what the risks are of staying compared to the risks of moving, they may find that the bet is skewed in one direction.
Can I just
Yeah, just on that, and I'll bring
Isn't
up
it the
others.
case, Professor Peat, and we've had this, and I know of this with one particular bank, that when they talk about moving down south, what they will probably do is not move talk about moving their operations, but set up a small holding company, perhaps for tax purposes, and that's really what certainly is happening. I know with other institutions, and there's a bit of clarity required around these kinds of statements about moving RBS moving to London, when in fact they might be setting up a holding company with about 20 people in it.
I think RBS employs slightly more than 20 people in London at the moment.
Yeah.
But in terms of what one scenario might be, one could envisage leaving at Gogarburn those who run the Scottish operations and some aspects of the overseas operations, which can be efficiently run from here, because there are a lot of aspects that make it capable to be efficient, but taking the formal head office for financial regulation and other terms away from Scotland. Now that, I think, is a scenario that may be under consideration.
I wanted to come in. I'll let you come in briefly, and then one more question from Chickwood. I think Sir John Gieve and then Monique Ebell.
Well, I agree very much that moving it isn't necessarily moving thousands of people and kit south of the border, but there's obviously a risk that if you do put your headquarters formally outside Scotland, that over time some of the high salaried posts, or a greater proportion of those, move south. I thought there were three very powerful reasons why all the financial institutions in Scotland will be considering this. Firstly, there's the powerful consideration of dealing with a regulator you already know, the devil you know. I mean, all these institutions will have carried out over many years, reached accommodations on a host of regulatory questions, so it's no small thing to switch to a new unknown regulator. Secondly, that regulator they've got at the moment has quite a powerful voice in international financial rule-making. I mean, notably with Mark Carney being head of the Financial Stability Board, but also in Basel and Brussels, a greater weight than a new Scottish regulator. But most importantly, for banks, at any rate, their own credit rating depends to some degree on the credit rating of their home government still. And so that will be, I mean, they'll be worried that keeping their main headquarters in Scotland could lead to a higher cost of funds for their own borrowing.
Yes, I wanted to take up Professor Peat's point about the financial sector and make a link back to the currency choice, in particular to the viability of the so-called Plan B of an informal currency union. So one thing that is important to remember, also particularly in terms of the bank's function, lending to Scottish businesses and allowing them to grow, is that these banks, even if the large banks move their operations south of the border, the banks that would be serving the Scottish domestic economy would be left without a lender of last resort. Right? Now, dollarized economies such as Panama deal with this, or banks in dollarized economies deal with this by having very high capital ratios, much higher than those would be currently required by any kind of Bank of England or Basel regulation. Now, that would put a brake on Scottish banks' ability to lend to Scottish businesses and to facilitate their growth. So I think this is one aspect, if you're concerned about productivity, that should be considered carefully.
One last question.
That, I'm afraid, flies in the face, doesn't it, of Standard & Poor's report last week, where it mentions, first of all, that Scotland's wealth levels are comparable to that of the UK, would qualify for their highest economic assessment, and then goes on to say the assets of Scotland's banks and building societies, including the Royal Bank, etc., account for 12.5 times Scotland's mainland GDP versus 4.6% in the UK. 4.6 times, yeah. So,
I think you've misunderstood my point. What I'm saying is that if Scotland were to dollarise, were to enter an informal currency union with the rest of the UK, Scottish banks would not have a natural lender of last resort. Right? A lender of last resort is generally a central bank that can print money. Now, that is, maybe put in simpler terms, Scottish banks would be left without an insurer and would have to self-insure by holding greater reserves. So I'm not talking about the state of the Scottish banking industry currently. I'm looking forward to the case in which there might be dollarization. And I'm saying that banks would deal with that situation of being left without an insurer by self-insuring, by holding higher capital reserves, which would leave them with less capital to lend to Scottish businesses, right? And that might have an impact going forward on the growth of Scottish firms.
Okay. We'll need to move on. I'm conscious of the time. We're already more than halfway through the session, and we've got through 3 members' questions, so we'll need to sharpen up a little bit, if we can, on questions and responses. I'll go to Margaret McDougall and then Alison Johnson. Margaret McDougall.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. Could I just perhaps ask a question to Professor MacDonald? In your written evidence, you suggest that sterlingisation would give Scotland the economic status of a failed state. Does this mean that Alex Salmon should find a new plan B for currency?
Well, as I've argued previously, the short answer to your last question is yes, very much so. I believe that any form of sterlingisation, including a formal currency union or an informal currency union, is affected by the kind of issues I mentioned earlier with respect to oil shocks. We enter a completely different scenario if we're independent. Professor Muscatelli mentioned the way you deal with that, I think, is through an oil fund. Well, in practical terms, you've got to build up an oil fund. I don't know how many years that would take for an independent Scotland. But you've got to remember also that oil shocks affect a country's terms of trade. They affect the overall level of demand and income in a country. And as the Norwegian experience shows, that if you're going to use an oil fund or a sovereign wealth fund to control these terms of trade shocks, you've got to have a separate currency. So no matter how you cut this, the resource curse or the asymmetric shocks introduced by oil being a dominant force in your terms of trade have got to be addressed. So any form of sterlingisation would be bad news, and the options of what we call dollarisation or sterlingisation and a currency board would be even worse news than a currency board. So hence the expression that it would be a sign of a failed state, because they're not addressing this central issue, which eventually, by the time oil depletes, if it's not addressed, you'll have no export sector which is not based on oil. That's the reality.
Thank you for that. And I think that was the view from the opening remarks of most of the panel, that they thought it should be an independent currency. Could I perhaps ask a question of Professor Peat then? Because, you know, you said that you thought that an independent currency would be the preference if a monetary union could not be negotiated and there would be difficulties around that. You said that there would have to be a very tight fiscal policy if there was an independent currency. Could you perhaps, for the non-economists, can't even say it, economists like myself, say what that means for the man and woman in the street? You know, is it higher taxation, lower public services?
It is that way around. I think that, first of all, on your question regarding dollarisation, I think that this meets my first criterion of providing, at least initially, stability in terms of the exchange rate, which would be beneficial to Scotland. But from reading a number of comments and a number of examinations of success and otherwise with dollarisation around the world, it does lead me to share the view of others on this panel that it would be a very difficult option to proceed with and would lead to a lot of potentially adverse effects. So I think that that leads me to believe that if the currency union is not feasible, then the own currency is the answer. But I would actually say, so far as a tight fiscal policy is concerned, which means having relatively high taxes and low public finances in order to secure a low or non-existent deficit year on year and to reduce the debt level relative to GDP over time at a reasonable rate. I think that would probably apply to each of the options that one consider. The difficulty is for a newly emerging country with a new currency or trying to tie itself to another currency, it needs to establish credibility, as has been mentioned by others. To establish credibility, particularly when a lot of your revenue comes from a volatile and uncertain source like oil and gas revenues, which may go up sharply but may go down, that means that you have to run a tight ship. And running a tight ship means proving that you can manage your public finances sensibly, and that means actually getting your deficit down to very low levels and keeping it low and helping to get your debt to GDP levels down. So whether you go through a currency union or sterlingization or an independent currency, I think at least initially, in order to prove credibility with the financial markets, it will be necessary to run tight fiscal policy, and probably, if you want to maintain a relatively stable currency if it's independent, quite tight monetary policy, relatively high interest rates as well. So I think one has to look at both those instruments and consider that, in initial years, proving credibility will involve being quite rigid.
So does that mean then that we would expect higher taxation, income tax, for example? And
the choice of how a lower deficit or zero deficit, whatever was the target, was achieved would be for the government, is exactly how it managed public expenditure and how it managed the different elements of taxation. The end product required would be a story on the public finances that was seen to be tight and seen to be sustainable and therefore credible as a long-term solution. Exactly how individual elements were managed would be primarily, if not entirely, for the Scottish Government to manage.
So really, in layman's terms, tight fiscal policy could mean tightening of belts.
Well, especially if the requirement was, as Professor Muscatelli has suggested and others have suggested, to build up an oil fund. If you want to build up an oil fund for short or long-term stability, that means taking money out of your revenue stream and putting it away for a rainy day or a subsequent day. And that means having less money to actually spend on public services than you would if you didn't take that money away. Now, given the volatility of oil revenues and uncertainty, it does make sense to establish some form of oil fund. But doing it when you start with quite tight public finances is difficult, and it will take time. And the more money you squirrel away for later, the less you've got to spend now.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Alison Johnson.
Morning. The Westminster Coalition asserted a few weeks ago that there would be no monetary union, and yes, since that's happened, we seem to have done nothing but debate all the alternatives. So we clearly must think that perhaps George Osborne and Danny Alexander are bluffing, or perhaps we don't think they'll even be in a position to influence that decision when the time comes. But clearly, I think a lot of Scots will vote yes in the hope of divergence, in the hope of sort of divergent policies because of frustrations with the current situation. What impact will the currency decision have on the ability of Scotland to become a more equal society in the case of a yes vote? And I'd like to put that question to Professors MacDonald and Peat in the first instance.
Can I just clarify with you, if we stick with the currency union or in terms of any currency arrangements?
I probably just want to understand what impact the currency decision will have on our ability to become a more equal society. So, what is the best currency decision to enable us to address inequality?
Okay, well, I think this comes back to what I was saying earlier. For example, one of the aims, I believe, of the Scottish Government is to improve productivity and economic growth post-independence, and perhaps by doing that you deal with inequality. But the issue then comes down to what your exchange rate regime is, because it's well known that productivity changes have a very direct effect on a country's competitiveness. That is essentially, loosely speaking, its inflation relative to its trading partner. Now, if you don't have a mechanism to address these changes in inflation, if you don't have, say, an exchange rate to adjust, then your competitiveness is going to be changing. And again, that will affect your non-oil or the sectors which are not affected by the productivity changes. So it's that dilemma that an independent country faces, and particularly in the context of the resource, that has got to be balanced with the non-oil sector. If it's not, you risk shrinking your non-oil sector, and as oil is depleted, you end up without a non-oil sector, and of course that is very bad news. So it's that kind of balancing act. How do you do it? My argument is you can only do that with a separate currency. You can't do it in the context of a monetary union. It's simply impossible, because what we call terms of trade shocks, that's the relative price of your exports to your imports, will be shocked all the time, and that because of these oil shocks, changes in the price of oil, and that feeds through in a very direct way into the country's competitiveness. And these movements in competitiveness in a net exporting country of oil have got to be dealt with, or you're going to have really serious effects on your non-oil sector.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I address that question to Professor Peat?
Well, I think if one is in the position of a currency union, then one can expect to have what John Gieve called exceptionally controlling terms. Now, to the extent that involves more than just saying what your public finance deficit has to be and your sustainable debt, depends on the extent to which your freedom to develop other policies is concerned. If it is simply a requirement that the deficit level shall be X and the sustainable debt over time shall be Y, then you can work within that envelope, and you can develop policies within Scotland that can achieve the objectives that the Scottish Government wishes on behalf of the Scottish people. Now, in order to be able to achieve increasing equality within Scotland most effectively, you need to be productive, you need to be competitive, you need to be able to grow your economy. Then you can use the fruits of that growth to whatever ends you so wish. So what really matters is getting that productivity and competitiveness, and then for the government on behalf of the people to determine how best to deploy the resources, how best to aim at just letting it rip in whatever way, or having some views on the balances that you wish within that society. Now, if the UK government, in the terms that it imposed under a currency union, also laid down other conditions, then that may limit the scope for Scotland taking divergent policies, which may then limit the potential for Scotland to achieve enhanced productivity growth, and also may limit its capability of going for greater egalitarianism. So it depends on the deal that can be struck. Now, a deal can always be struck on these things. It's a matter of how tight and how constraining that is. If you move to an independent currency, then it will be overall macroeconomic policies that are judged by the markets and others in determining whether this is the right approach, and whether one has a currency that is sufficiently stable in order to enable the non-oil sector to develop in the way that Professor MacDonald has just described. But it's unlikely that there would be the risk of other constraints on policies that might be imposed under the currency union. But what really matters is getting that non-oil and gas sector competitive, getting efficient, getting it to grow in such a way that welfare can be enhanced across Scotland in the ways that Scotland wishes. And that is why I've emphasised the other part of this question, which is actually trying to get productivity and competitiveness up, because I think that is what matters at the end of the day. And one should see the currency solution in that context rather than somehow as an end of itself.
Can I ask Dr. Ebell a question? It was regarding your earlier discussion, I think, perhaps with Mr. Brodie. Last week we heard from Professor David Simpson, and I think he suggested that that lack of lender of last resort could be a positive in some regards, that it would encourage sensible policy from the word go, and that, you know, the banking sector should be, that we're having a sort of change of emphasis on who'd be bailing out in the future, that management and stakeholders and creditors would have to bear the brunt. I just wonder if you have any comment on what he was telling us last week.
Certainly, and I have two responses to that. The first is that I think Professor Simpson takes perhaps a rather optimistic view of the loyalty of financial institutions then to Scotland, in the sense that if financial institutions are faced with a choice of a regime south of the border in which they do have access to lender of last resort, which would enable them to maintain lower capital ratios and hence lend more of their money profitably, and a choice of a regime in which they would need to be self-insuring to replace that lost lender of resort, which would be costly to them, right? Which means they would have to hold higher capital buffers, would have less money available to lend to the Scottish economy, and would, of course, would probably have a lower rate of profits. I somehow think that if I were a bank, I'm fairly certain I know where I would go. Now, that said, there are certainly advantages in terms of financial stability to banks having high capital ratios, in the sense that then they will not need to accede to access the insurance provided by the central bank, or indeed that is then backed up by the taxpayer. That does come at a cost, and that's the cost that I was trying to describe to your colleague, that there would then be fewer funds available for lending to Scottish businesses, Scottish households, fewer funds to support the kind of growth and productivity that you would be aiming for.
John McAlpin.
Well, thank you very much, Convener. My question is for Professor Muscatelli. The Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Danny Alexander, described transaction costs as a relatively small factor. That's without a formal currency union. In your written evidence, you cite transaction costs as between 500 million and 2.5 billion plus for our UK business if a sterling area couldn't be negotiated. Isn't that rather a high cost for business?
It is a high cost, I would say, and just to explain where that comes from, where those figures come from, it's based on the sort of estimates that were given of transactions costs in various studies. One Market, One Money, which was done by the European Commission at the beginning, we'd estimated around 0.1% of GDP as the sort of transaction costs reduction within the European Monetary Union. And indeed, there was, I think, a study of the Treasury around the 5 tests when the UK was considering entering EMU, which put them potentially as high as 0.5%, that's where that range comes from. So I would say that is not trivial, because these are costs that don't disappear. But the other point I would make is that there's other costs which are difficult to quantify, which is around essentially the reduction in trade. And there's an interesting debate around this, and you see that in some of the papers of the National Institute that Dr. Ebell and others have contributed to. I mean, my own view, having reviewed that literature, is that there would be a reduction in trade, a substantial reduction in trade, if one abandoned the sterling currency zone between Scotland and the rest of the UK, and that would be a cost to the rest of the UK. One other point is that there are certain things which you can't hedge. I mean, you can hedge when there's currency risk, but one thing that you can't hedge is an investment decision. So, for instance, if a Scottish company after independence wanted to make an investment in England and it wasn't a common currency, or vice versa, if an English company wanted to make an investment across the border, not having a common currency would create a risk which couldn't be hedged that easily. And then there's all sorts of other issues, which is around trying to find, not finding an agreed framework, I think could lead to other difficulties. It was interesting, actually, again, reading the piece that was written by Dr. Armstrong and Dr. Ebell. If you end up in a situation where you cannot achieve an agreement on following independence on, say, issues around debt negotiation, that actually, and the example that was given, I think, was of the Netherlands and Belgium following 1830. You can actually have some very serious impacts on the risk spreads of both countries. So I suppose what I'm saying is, ideally, you should have a negotiated agreement to all of this around the currency. But there are costs, which are transactions costs, investment costs, reduction in trade flows, which would have a serious impact on the rest of the UK as well as Scotland.
Of the plus points of a sterling union, you say that there are other benefits which are less easy to quantify, and I wondered if you would like to have a stab at quantifying them.
They are very difficult to quantify. I mean, for instance, I know the Fiscal Commission mentions one factor, which is that, of course, if Scotland becomes the main oil exporter and some of those exports in oil and gas go to the rest of the UK, I think they quantify that at 13.6 billion in terms of of exports from Scotland. Now, that has an impact to the extent that that goes to the rest of the UK. Again, that would create a risk on the other side. I think it's very difficult to quantify. I'll give you one more quantification, which is that one of the studies that I do think is best done in so-called trade gravity models suggests that a currency union enhances trade by 40% between participating countries, which is actually quite close to some of the original estimates. I appreciate there's other studies which show different results, but 40% is actually a hell of an impact on the rest of the UK and Scotland in terms of the potential reduction in trade flows between us if a currency union wasn't maintained.
Yeah, just a couple of quick points on that. I think, all of the evidence shows that transactions costs are a small percentage of GDP. They are relatively small in the bigger scheme of things. And one point I'd like to make in terms of this burden that the rest of the UK is going to have, no one's pointed out that if Scotland had a new currency, then all that would happen in the rest of the UK is businesses would continue to invoice in sterling. And so the costs would actually be borne by Scottish consumers. Now, we don't know at the moment what the sensitivity of demand for English exports is. I dare say there would be some fall in English exports, remaining UK exports, but it's highly unlikely it's going to fall to zero. But I would argue that even if it did, that is 4% of the rest of UK's GDP. That's the worst case scenario that we're talking about here, which isn't going to happen, but that's the worst case scenario. If you compare the costs of a currency union or a monetary union, which is known not to be irrevocable breaking up, they are going to be a huge multiple of that number. That is unambiguous. If you look at the effects of any recent crisis on the UK economy, the numbers are going to be much, much bigger. So I think it's very important to put into perspective these transactions costs and who actually bears them.
If I could just ask one question. Dr. Ebell earlier spoke about Scotland inheriting its share of UK debt, but you talked about that in the context of an informal sterling area. Now, last week when Professor David Bell was here and he was asked about debt if Scotland was not the continuing state, he made the point that the debt actually belongs to the UK. And a number of our panellists last week talked about the attractiveness, in their view, of a country starting out with no debt at all. I wondered what you thought about that.
Well, this is a big issue, of course, and an important one for Scotland. I think it's important to remember that although in technical terms, the UK, the rest of the UK, would remain responsible for the entire debt, international markets who would be interested in lending to Scotland in the future would certainly be watching to see to what extent Scotland met its obligations with respect to the rest of the UK. Another important point to remember is that Scotland not honouring its obligations to, or its commitments to repay its share of the debt, to compensate the rest of the UK, both for debt servicing and for its share of the debt principal, would certainly also attract the interest of other countries who would be concerned about their own regions deciding to do a similar thing, to, say, secede or to declare independence, and to then not honour their share of the debt. And I think that Scotland not servicing or repaying its share of the debt would set a rather dangerous precedent and might not be looked very kindly upon by some other countries.
Move on. Richard Baker.
Anonymous question for Professor Muscatelli. You've referred to comments by the Governor of Bank of England several times in your submission yesterday. He told the Treasury Select Committee that Scotland would need currency reserves multiple times the size of its GDP, many billions of pounds, to withstand tests by international markets, whether we're in a currency union or whether we use that awful phrase of sterlingisation. How would that be afforded by a newly separate Scotland?
Well, actually, I have read in part Mark Carney's comments at the Treasury Side Committee yesterday. I think he was rather more balanced in terms of his assessment. But I mean, I think if there's a currency union, it's a very different set of circumstances, because in those circumstances, clearly there would be UK sterling union responsibilities in terms of managing sterling. If you have your own currency, I think it then depends what sort of arrangement you want to have. And if you look at small European countries that are not part of the Eurozone, you have different arrangements. Denmark shadows the Euro, as I mentioned in my paper. Sweden doesn't.
Questions on reserves, though, reserves to back up that activity in the markets. I mean, I think
clearly what you wouldn't be, where you need substantial reserves would be if you had your own currency, and you wanted, say, to maintain something like Hong Kong currently has, a currency board arrangement vis-à-vis sterling. So I think that would be an issue, absolutely, but it wouldn't be an issue if you, say, decided to go your own currency, with your own currency, but to have the managed float. There's no reason why Scotland wouldn't have its proportion of UK foreign exchange reserves as part of the asset and liability negotiation, and so that wouldn't be an issue. And if you have a currency union, by definition, it wouldn't be up to Scotland to manage sterling. It would be up to Scotland and the rest of the UK in partnership to manage sterling. So the only issue, I think, would arise if you had a situation where Scotland had its own currency and then wanted to maintain a strict peg, say, to sterling.
Okay. On the issue of shocks to our economy, and I think obviously that's a factor in whether the rest of the UK want to be in the currency union with us. I mean, Professor Muscatelli kind of minimised the dangers of that in your submission, but Professor Peat, earlier on, you talked about the need to deal with fluctuations. I mean, the most recent figures show that oil and gas taxation fell from £11 billion to £6.5 billion in just 1 year, meaning that now our debt of GDP, our debt to GDP ratio is higher than the rest of the UK. I mean, doesn't that show that actually that is a difficult situation for an independent Scotland to deal with? And does it not also show that why there might well be some scepticism from the rest of the UK in terms of wanting to be in the currency union with Scotland?
I think the issue is complicated by the uncertainties over the future revenue streams. I mean, in Parliament at Holyrood a week or so back, we had Paul Johnson of the Institute of Fiscal Studies giving his extrapolation of debt levels, which came to a figure for likely Scottish debt to GDP being higher than that for the rest of the UK in 10 years' time or wherever. There are other perfectly viable extrapolations which show the different story. We just don't know. I mean, that is the clear problem, that we do not know what the level of oil and gas output or the prices will be over the next 10 years, and they have moved substantially in recent years. We've had very high levels of investment in the recent past, and we have expectations of high levels of investment going forward. Excellent. But we don't know what that means in terms of production from existing reserves. We don't know what it means in terms of finding new reserves that are viable at whatever price. So we don't know what the volume of output or the price is going to be. So a significant share of Scotland's public revenue is uncertain and volatile. And that does cause issues, as I noted when talking about the way in which public finance rules might have to be set up. It also, of course, potentially adds to the problems if you're trying a fixed peg in an independent currency, as Anton Muscatelli has said. If you've got those uncertainties, that adds to the difficulty of managing it and may add to the need to have high levels of reserves and to have quite tight policies in order to manage a peg. Now, if one went with an individual currency, I would prefer a system where the relationship with sterling was kept fairly stable because of the ideas I've given before. But actually that might prove very problematic, and a managed float without a desired relationship with sterling would be easier to manage from both a currency reserve point of view and from a fiscal policy point of view.
On a brief question, Convener, for Professor Peat, you've been very senior working in government departments, and so I wanted to get your view, given particularly that on this panel today we've had, apart from Professor Muscatelli, either downright opposition to a currency union or very, very lukewarm support, but very broad agreement that there should be that a separate currency, a new currency, would be a viable plan B. Isn't it extraordinary that the Scottish Government's approach at the moment is the UK Government's not serious, we're not putting forward a plan B? Wouldn't it be better for not just the electorate but for markets as well to have a clear plan B, particularly based on the evidence that we've heard today?
I'm a great believer in transparency. I'm a great believer in careful evidence-based analysis. I think that it is right to give proper scrutiny to the arguments the Treasury and others have put forward about a currency union. I don't believe anything is impossible. I think there are ways of doing it, but the terms may be ones that are or are not acceptable. Therefore, I think it is appropriate to look at the alternatives. We've been doing that. A lot of people have been doing that. The trouble is there's no straightforward slam-dunk solution that is there for us all to grab at, which is why it's right to look at sterlingization. And I think that some people might argue that it is feasible. It's right to look at having an independent currency with or without a peg to sterling. These are all options that need to be considered, and I'm all in favour of the National Institute, David Bell, Anton Muscatelli, Ronald MacDonald, and all the academic, high-quality academics that you've got involved, giving their views and trying to clarify so we can all form a firm view of what the genuine options are and what the costs and benefits associated with each might be.
Okay. Christian Allard.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. It's still morning. I would like, first of all, to ask a question to Professor Jeremy Peat. It's regarding, I've been here for 30 years, and we heard a lot this morning about what an independent Scotland might bring and or the downfall of an independent Scotland. But I've been here living here 30 years, and I've seen the decline in manufacturing industry the last 30 years. And I've seen how much it affected the UK and it's affected the Scotland particularly. And we kept very, and we heard it this morning, that the Scottish economy is very varied and very rich and prosperous, but unfortunately on the manufacturing sector we've lost ground, and I would like you to reflect on the fact that the current account deficit for the 29 of the last 33 years, how can we explain that in the UK, and how does that will affect but how will that explain the Scotland's performance on bird, particularly because it's more relevant to you, to what you said so far this morning?
I've been watching the Scottish economy for 29 years now, carefully, and the year before that from Treasury in London, so it's about the same period as you've been living here. And I think that throughout the period from the time I was at the Scottish office to the time at RBS and subsequently, there has been this continuing issue of why there has not been far more beneficial use made of the remarkably high quality and high quantum higher education research and development takes place in Scotland. And I'm not being critical of the universities, because I know Anton's universities and Heriot Watt and Edinburgh and others really work very hard to try and see how that R&D can be made use of to aid innovation, productivity and competitiveness in Scotland. But the history, the story on business investment in research and development is depressing relative to the story on higher education research and development. And we do need to explore why. And we do need to stimulate an environment in which there is greater demand from the business community for innovation and interrelationship with the high-quality academics that we have undertaking that work. And we do need also to set up the incentive mechanisms in such a way that those in universities are incentivized as much by making use of what they produce by way of innovative potential within the business community as by academic journal articles that may actually help in some of the assessments that take place. I want to see that desire on both sides to innovate, to make use of the marvellous work that's going on in a number of sectors across Scotland. Whether that's in manufacturing or whether that's elsewhere, I'm not particularly worried. but I believe there is huge potential that is there, that's latent there. And why does it happen in Cambridge but not in Scotland? I don't know the answers to some of this, but I do believe that we're really interested in Scotland maximising its potential. Then making use of this R&D is critical, and an innovative, productive, competitive Scotland is what we all seek.
Thanks very much for your answer. If I could put a supplementary on this, Professor Peat, I found it astonishing that this morning we heard about the banking sector on one side and the oil and gas sector on the other side. And really, you know, if we want a new generation of youngsters to get involved in something more productive, wouldn't it be no more the energy sector than it would be the banking sector after what we saw the last few years?
I think the energy sector has a great deal of potential. I think we need to see what can evolve from renewable sources that can be competitive within the environment. We need to see what the arrangements would be in the event of independence in terms of how energy produced in Scotland could be exported to the rest of the UK and elsewhere in order to provide external markets. But first of all, we need to make sure that those renewable sources are genuinely competitive, and that takes time to develop, and it also takes the right finance to get past the development phase. It's a difficult story to get there. The potential is there but for production, but whether the potential is there for competitive production in the short to medium term begs a lot of questions.
If I may add to the members of the panels, I'm not an economist myself, like my colleague Margaret MacDonald said, but I found it very, very strange how we can explain to the people of Scotland who are going to take that particular vote in September that somehow oil and gas, you know, the energy sector is a curse. But the banking sector, after what happened the last few years, is an asset we are desperate to keep. Can you explain it on words that I can go back to the doorstep and explain to the people?
Perhaps, I mean, I used the phrase the resource curse, so perhaps I should address that. The way to think about this is, fine, if you one day don't have oil and the next day you discover it, it's great for the overall population. You've got this windfall gain. We're all much wealthier. We're all much better off. That's not really the point. We're looking at how to design an appropriate exchange rate mechanism for a country. And we know that that country already has a very well-diversified non-oil export sector, from financial services to buses to computers, whatever. The point is that the shocks that we observe in oil sectors are different to the shocks we observe in the non-oil sector. They're called supply-side shocks. It's just the nature. Prices of oil, as we know, the price of oil goes up and down. So a key indicator of a country's competitiveness is what we call the terms of trade, which is your export prices in terms of your import prices. As soon as you're an exporter, net exporter of oil, the numerator in that relationship, the export term, changes. You've got oil in there bouncing around, which affects the competitiveness of the non-oil sector. It's a real issue.
I understand it, but just simple words which I was looking for. Maybe Professor
it is quite a difficult concept, but it is a concept which is a real issue in all net exporters. If you go to the Gulf states, they're very keen to diversify away from oil, but they find it very difficult because of the effect that oil has on their competitiveness, on their relative inflation. Their inflation moves differently to their competitors. It's just the nature of having oil, basically, yeah.
If I could address that, I mean, I think there's two parts to your question. The first is in relation to the macroeconomics, and as Ronnie says, and I think as the Fiscal Commission also recognises, if you have a volatile element, you need to manage that, and which is why you need an oil fund, savings fund to deal with that. The second point, however, of your question is very interesting, which is around industrial structure and economic development. I think there's no doubt, and I think to echo what Jeremy said, you need to address these issues in the long run, because no economy can depend on one, two large sectors. It's too risky, and for any economy to just depend on whether it's financial services and oil and gas. And I think one of the key things there will be to actually produce a well-diversified economy that takes account of the high skills that Scotland has, and the high levels of R&D, as Jeremy pointed out, in higher education. And that's about the composition of your spend. It's nothing to do with the overall fiscal and monetary policy. It's to do where do you direct your spend? And not surprisingly, there was a very interesting study by the Institute for Fiscal Studies around the whole issue of independence, which compared what small open economies do and how they direct their spend relative to larger economies. I think that's the sort of thing that certainly politicians should be aware of and look at. Not surprisingly, you'll find that a lot of their spend is directed towards economic development, education, and away from things like defence, which of course are less important for smaller countries than for larger countries. So these are the sort of issues you need to look at.
A question for Professor Peat. You had previously said, I believe, that after Mark Carney's wise pronouncement, quote, the arrangements for a currency union should be discussed potentially between the Scottish and UK government. Are you disappointed that the UK government's ruled that out?
Yes, may I just make one comment from the previous question that I should have made? Of course, that one concern with the oil and gas sector is that the exchange rate for an independent Scotland might rise sharply. If it rose sharply because of high revenues from oil and gas, high prices, then that would make it much more difficult for the non-oil and gas sector to be competitive and develop. So it's a very simple point that I just wanted to add in. Going back to your question, yes, I suppose I am a bit disappointed. I thought that the comment came from Mark Carney, this was about 2 months ago, and I thought, yes, well, that's right, this should be quiet, technical discussions, because I've seen comments from Professor Brown Quinn and others about the difficulties of some aspects of the currency union. I've read all the material from the National Institute and elsewhere, and obviously there are complexities, the lender of the last resort, the steering, the oversight of the banking and financial sector. They are difficult, they are problematic, as well as issues which are crucial but perhaps more straightforward in some sense about how you deal with fiscal policy and the management of monetary policy. So I would have liked to see the professionals sitting down with open minds and seeing exactly what could be achieved. How could one potentially move to a situation where the currency union could work in the interests of both parties? It may well be that the outcome was that it was extremely difficult and there were real constraints from the rest of the UK perspective. But I would have liked to have seen that that professional discussion, which perhaps took place behind closed doors, but was full, frank and even-handed.
Last week we had Crawford Beveridge here from the Fiscal Commission saying that they'd been able to engage reasonably well with the Bank of England, but not at all with the UK government. Is there a contrast there that you would observe as well?
Well, I think that the first place that this discussion should take place is with the Bank of England on a technical basis. When you go beyond that, the government needs to be involved. But the first point is, let's get down to the technical matters and see what could be achieved and what couldn't be achieved and what the real tough problems are and whether there is a way forward that might make sense. And that's the technical discussion with the Bank of England.
So John Gieve, former Deputy Governor, caught my eye, so bring him in.
Well, perhaps coming to the defence of my old colleagues in the Treasury, I mean, surely what you need is a degree of certainty on what is going to be negotiable and what isn't. And it hasn't surprised me that the Treasury officials have said that they would advise against a currency union, and the ministers have said they agree. So that brings some certainty to the debate, I'd have thought.
Thank you. I think the note said they would disagree to it as currently proposed, which seems quite difficult given that there aren't any negotiations over the arrangements. But I want to move on to another question for Professor Muscatelli on the basis of what he said about the currency zone. Do you think it would be possible and feasible to have the kind of consistent financial regulation across that currency zone that I think is needed?
I think it would be. Certainly, it's most likely to happen within a currency zone. I mean, some of this has already been discussed. Clearly, I think all of us would agree that it's absolutely essential to have much better regulatory and supervisory arrangements in terms of, if you're talking about the regulation of the financial sector particularly, we all agree that one of the big failures of the financial crisis was around regulatory and supervision arrangements, and Sir John Gieve has also highlighted this very well. I think it's easier to do it in that context, but if that weren't to happen, if there were to be a separate currency for Scotland, then clearly there are international arrangements which would need to be adhered to. But I certainly think that that would need to be part of the negotiation if there were to be a currency area, and I think anything's possible. Post the vote, then I think that would need to be part of the discussion, and clearly there would need to be a single supervisory arrangement and regulatory arrangement across the whole of the financial sector in RUK and Scotland.
But you think that is essentially workable?
Yes.
All right, that's fine. Thank you very much. We are just very slightly behind the clock, so we've all done very well. Thank you to all our witnesses for coming along and helping us out. That's been very useful to the committee. We will now suspend briefly and then go into private session. Thank you.